Well, what we do is about 45 minutes of, you and I talk, and then they come in.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
That's great.
So
I like the
you'll probably last 7:15, 7:30.
Perfect. Perfect. The McClatchy bigwigs are in town.
Oh, yeah. My
So
golly.
My husband's life has much changed.
Oh,
because
my
he'll
gosh,
become
because,
the Washington Bureau Chief for the whole shebang.
Yeah.
So
That's
we're
a lot of
dining with
papers.
some of them tonight. The
Yeah.
timing works fine. It's a lot of papers. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's,
It's going to be 32 in all after they sell the ones they're going to sell.
yeah.
It's too bad they have to sell.
Oh, I know it. I just think, the Mercury,
I know, and the
and
Philadelphia
the Inquirer. Yeah, that's really a fantastic,
thing.
fantastic paper.
Well, antitrust because for the St. Paul Pioneer Press because McClatchy owns Minneapolis. The others are because McClatchy's business strategy is to buy newspapers in growth markets. And Philadelphia and Akron are not. And interestingly enough, San Jose, the fiscal situation is really pretty bad. So that's the one that surprised me. Of course, after the great boom, they grew, and now it's a pretty. They're really making very low profits. So.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're in San Jose,
Michael, are we ready? All the sound and everything's all right?
Yeah.
Good evening. We have another good session for you this evening. Our guest is Geneva Overholser, who has had a career in a lot of looking at journalism and the news business from a lot of different angles, because she was editor of the Des Moines Register. She is the ombudsperson at the Washington Post, and she's teaching in the journalism school at the University of Missouri. So you see it, and you are married to the bureau chief of McClatchy, which is much in the news. So you see the business from a lot of different angles. What we're doing in the course is trying to get a sense of what do citizens need to know in a democracy, and what kind of information is government giving us. Are we getting the kinds of things that we should, and if we aren't, why aren't we? So it's general, but then we get down to some specifics as well.
Excellent. It's a great topic. I'm glad you're doing it.
Yeah, it is, and it's very much the topic. The book that they have to read is The Press.
Oh, that's great.
Edited
Marvelous.
by Geneva Overholser and Kathleen Jameson. Yeah, and it's a book that's worked very well.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, it's been very good.
Excellent. Hello, everyone.
Yeah. So what information do you think that the public needs in a representative government?
You know, I honestly believe, Martha, that they need everything they possibly can have. That doesn't mean that they can have everything. I mean, nobody can be a complete absolutist on this, because I think we all have to acknowledge that there are always going to be some kinds of information, genuine national security threats, troop movements. I mean, we can begin to name several that I think almost anyone would agree we can't possibly put into all of our hands. But the fact is, we, in a very basic sense, need all the information we can get in order to govern ourselves. And if we're going to have a government by the people, for the people, of the people, then we've got to know what's going on. So I mentioned to you I was on this program recently with Tom Blanton, who's the head of the National Security Archive. I'm sure you know him. And he mentioned something that might be interesting to share with the students. He said only one time in the Constitution is secrecy mentioned. I'd never really thought about this. It's in Article 1, Section 5, and it says, each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings and from time to time publish the same, excepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. But it's the only mention of secrecy in the Constitution, and it's clearly the exception, not the rule. What worries me is that there are all kinds of reasons, beside the really valid ones, that those in power would prefer to keep information secret.
What are some of the reasons?
Mere convenience. I mean, it's awkward. I think all of us who've ever run anything know that it's really pretty awkward to have to let all the information out. It's going to be much more complex to govern in some ways. Sometimes facts are embarrassing. That's a big one. If we make mistakes, it's kind of human nature to keep them to ourselves. But how are we to know when information is kept from us which of these secrets are genuine secrets and which of them are secrets of convenience.
And, well, we can take some, we've had a lot of cases where news organizations and government have disagreed over what information should remain private. For example, the NSA eavesdropping story that the New York Times held for a year.
Yes.
That a lot of, when that came out, it made a great deal of difference to members of Congress.
Indeed, and there are people who feel that the great sin was the exposure of this information. There are others, of course, who feel that the great sin, to use a sort of a strange word, was the original wiretapping without warrants, according to the process laid out. Same with the secret prisons in European countries. Both of those stories, as you noted, the New York Times held the wiretapping one for a year. The Washington Post did not mention some of the European cities in which prisons were. Both of those show that even those eager media who are trying to get the word out are willing to weigh, I think sometimes too heavily, a government request to keep information private. You know, we often get the notion that somehow the press is just out there revealing willy-nilly and not thoughtfully weighing these decisions, and that is not my experience.
What did you think about the Times holding the story?
I'm a little troubled by it. I think there are valid reasons to hold the story. I didn't think their explanation of it was terribly satisfactory, partly because their public editor, which is sort of the equivalent of the ombudsman, as you know, Byron Kalame, was not satisfied either. So he gave us reason to worry that maybe the Times didn't have all the best reasons. I'm sure a lot of them were about sourcing, and I respect the need to be very sure about your sources. I think it's commendable they did put the story out, and I would note that despite their having waited, they caught hell for putting it out, and now Bush is, you know, clamping down even more on leaks, and there are all kinds of legal threats about those who do leak, and even people who publish leaks.
Yeah. But we've been in Washington a long time, and we know that there's no stopping the leaking business.
No, of course, those very governments who say they want to stop the leaks also want to leak in their own, you know, on their own schedule and with their own choice.
They just don't think of it as leaking.
Yeah, right.
They think of it as providing information at a time.
Slowly, telling the truth slowly.
That's right, a time and a method of their choosing.
Which, of course, you know, I mean, those leaks, too, are often useful, but it's a hypocritical stance to say they want to stop leaks.
Well, and then you can say in this administration, the White House has not had a lot of leaks, but the departments and agencies certainly have.
Well, you know, I mean, it hasn't, you know, this White House far better than I do, but of course we can consider it leaks. For example, all those conversations with Bob Woodward, I mean, in many ways, which end up in his book, are leaks of a fashion.
Yeah, right.
I mean, they do leak conveniently.
Those are decisions that they've made to provide information to selected people, and that's one of the things they've done in this White House is they give information in bits and give it to specific people.
And it's all about managing information. And no one, I think, would reasonably say that people who govern us don't have a right to try to get the story out. But the basic question that I think you're looking at is, what does the citizen have a right to know? And the kinds of stories that have come out recently about citizens not being able to gain information would give any citizen chills. I was hearing one the other day about a group of citizens, I'm trying to think where they were, in what state, who were trying to gather information about a pipeline that was in fact going right through their property, and they weren't being told anything. And they finally applied for a Freedom of Information Act, you know, used the procedures in order to get the information. And the documents they got were all the names of the people who were affected by it were redacted, that is to say, completely inked out. And of course, the corporations didn't want the people to get these names because they might become activists. Well, this is democracy. I mean, we would hope we are giving people the information they need to become activists.
Yeah. What kinds of efforts are there to provide in the state level Freedom of Information Acts so that that most states have them?
They vary widely,
Yeah.
as you know. There are some terrific ones. Florida is particularly well known for its sunshine laws and for keeping information open. It has a director who is provided in the law the ability to have mediation provided by the state when there are differences about the information. There are penalties for not releasing information quickly through their equivalent of the FOI Act. So from, the states range all the way from that to very poor laws. I mean, there are some provisions in most states, and the National Freedom of Information Coalition, which is based at the Missouri School of Journalism, is trying to strengthen that through lobbying in various states. But states have been passing more laws lately that sort of protect certain pieces of information. And as you well know, we are classifying information federally at a much faster rate than we ever have before. I was just looking at some statistics. 15.6 million classification decisions in 2004. It was a record number. It costs us $7.2 billion to do that. Now that's if we need to do it, but do we really need to keep all this information secret?
Yeah. How have the efforts been at the state level in trying to open things up? If they're meeting against these currents of trying to shut things down.
I think that most people in the states feel, as observers feel nationally, that the trend is in the opposite direction from opening, and that there's an awful lot of work to be done to persuade people. Not that, we need to have near anarchy and just put all this information out there, but rather to persuade people that there is really a much better chance of solving problems when the information is in the open. That the way we'll fix things is by understanding them, and that problems fester when they are kept in the dark. I mean, I think that's the piece of all this that we've kind of lost track of as we've grown more and more fearful. 9/11 was clearly a step up in terms of people feeling like, well, we shouldn't be demanding this information, I mean, I think we saw this in the press. I was on a television show with Alan Simpson, former senator of Wyoming, just after 9/11, and he wagged his elegant bony finger at me and he said, well, now I hope that you'll get over this skepticism, you and the media. And I said, with all due respect, Senator Simpson, skepticism is patriotic for journalists. And yet I think that kind of thing, skepticism is patriotic for citizens, not cynicism, but we are supposed to be holding to their feet to the fire, the people who govern us. We're supposed to be questioning. We're supposed to be saying, are you doing the right thing in my name? And if we don't have the information to question, then, it really does become, you just start moving toward a sort of a tyranny. I thought it was remarkable that Sandra Day O'Connor used this term recently. I think plenty of Republicans as well as Democrats are worried about the fact that our government is holding more and more information close to its chest. And I think it's a very worrisome thing.
What is the way out? Who should be making decisions that the government shouldn't be holding it?
Well, I think it's really, in the end, the public. Now, it's easy to say, right? 280 million people strong stand up and believe.
Yeah.
But it is the public that needs to care. And the fact is there are an awful lot of people who care about this. Obviously, a lot of people in the press care. Lots of librarians who are very, very powerfully activists on behalf of information in the public interest. Trial lawyers. I mean, there are all kinds of organizations of people who care. There are these National Freedom of Information Coalitions. There are Open Government, openthegovernment.org, National Security Archive, all kinds of organizations. But I think it's hard to kind of pass word along to the public very effectively about the downside. In other words, what you don't know will hurt you, because we have people in power very effectively saying, I'm terribly sorry, we can't give you this information for very good reasons. We've got these national security reasons. And the media don't tend to tell the story very well. They have too often in the past, and I think this is a big mistake, they have too often sort of said, well, we're not supposed to pat ourselves on the back, we're not supposed to tell our own story, we're just supposed to sort of tell you what's going on. So you have things happen, like after Katrina in New Orleans, Mark Schlefstein, who's a reporter for the Times-Picayune, sought to find out, here were all these people with all this water and air that was clearly polluted. They knew there were chemicals in the water, sometimes 24 feet of water in the city of New Orleans, They knew it was full of chemicals and waste, but they didn't know what chemicals. And so here's the New Orleans Times-Picayune trying to get word to the readers and to the relief workers, who are there in New Orleans. So the government requires, when there are spills, that people record them at this. It's a FEMA record-taking web, and so, but the government took that off the website and wouldn't let Mark Schlestein, the reporter, know what it was either. I mean, they said, well, we can't, have these sources of chemicals on the website. I mean, people at the Sago mine disaster were very much affected by this because the government had taken information about mining off the website, 2 years previously? All of this kind of in the wake of 9/11. And so we know to be fearful, but we forget to remember that we will be stronger if we have more information. Not less secure.
Yeah. Well, the press seems to be good at digging in when there's a problem and demonstrating that a problem exists. And then they hit a brick wall in trying to get information out of the government because they don't have subpoena power. So in a way, they have to be able to activate parts of government, whether it's activating the Congress.
Absolutely. Congress is key, and we have certainly seen examples of congressional concern, actually on both sides in this wiretapping story, which you correctly raised. We've had members of Congress who are deeply concerned, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are deeply concerned about these wiretaps, which were done without warrants. But we've also had members of Congress who are outraged at the press for revealing it in the ultimate, blame the messenger thing.
Yeah.
So, you're exactly right. We have to activate others because the press can't really, the press can bring things to light, and then I think it's up to others, the public, to press for action from Congress, the Congress to read these things and respond as the leaders they are, the courts. But I have to say the courts are also a great cause of concern for those of us who believe in open government. They lately have been citing, in many cases, I think more and more, with the notion that you got to keep things secret. These things are cyclical. I don't mean to make it sound as if this is one terrible arc toward secrecy. It's definitely cyclical, but we're in a bad cycle.
Do you think that, say, one of the inefficiencies of government is when you have divided government, the president and the Congress or one house of Congress held by opposing parties? It's more difficult to govern. But on the other hand, as far as information is concerned, it's kind of environment where more information tends to bubble to the surface.
Definitely. Well, there we go with those leaks again, for one thing.
Yeah.
It's a little like, it's democracy as a whole, right? It's a pretty awkward, clumsy way to govern ourselves. What was that wonderful line that Churchill said? Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
Yeah, right.
It's the best we've got, and it takes some compromise. But if you don't believe in the public, you ought to go somewhere else. If you don't believe that the public here is capable of governing itself, then you ought to go somewhere else. And if you do believe it, then you got to give the public the information to govern itself. And of course, they're going to be secrets, but they ought to be minimal. They ought to be. You ought to be able to explain to the public why we can't do it. And it's become way too close to the default decision. If we don't, who's to say? It's just not a matter of I don't want them to know. It's inconvenient. It's embarrassing. Who's to say?
What does it take in terms of resources for say a newspaper? Because most of these stories, the prison story that you mentioned and the eavesdropping are ones that have come from newspapers. What does it take to dig out these stories as far as resources is concerned?
I'm deeply concerned, in fact, about the state of the media today, and I think the students ought to be thinking about this as well, because most American media institutions are under a great deal of profit pressure. That is to say, they are returning profits that most retailers could never dream of, even though we talk about the press being challenged and advertising moving online. All these things are true. So what you have is newsrooms which increasingly don't have a lot of time to put into the very time-consuming and expensive work that is original journalism, and particularly to put into investigative reporting. And you have an added pressure that goes back to this, the public after 9/11 doesn't always want to see, you know, President Bush questioned too hard by an obnoxious press, doesn't always believe that the press ought to be pressing on these secrets. So and here you have a press that is worried about its financial situation, doesn't really want to be unpopular, gets beaten up on from both the right and the left in this very divisive environment, and is under increasing profit pressure, and therefore in many newsrooms, most newsrooms, has fewer and fewer reporters, less and less news hole in the newspaper. And that's a bad situation, because in any city in the country, it is still the newspaper newsroom that is doing the most original reporting. And you know, we like to talk about the proliferation of media outlets. Michael Powell, when he was chairman of the FCC, the Federal Commerce Commission, talked about this great proliferation of media outlets. It isn't the outlets we ought to be worrying about, it's the inputs, and we are not seeing a proliferation of inputs. So you have all these bloggers, and I welcome it. It's great. It's a democratization of the web. But they are all talking about the information that is coming from these very narrow channels. This, again, very expensive proposition of original journalism. And that's what we need to be worrying about. How many places are going to go on doing it? Because, you know, citizen journalists are great, but how many of them are really going to go sit at the state legislature and listen to all the debate so that they can let the public know what parts of it they need to know? How many of them are going to do it with a commitment to fairness and balance and comprehensiveness and thoroughness? You know, it's true the media are quite flawed, but the goal of most journalists really is to try to give the public a full and fair and balanced report. And, you know, it's an expensive thing to do, and it's under threat in this country.
Yeah. I know, even in sitting in, say, in the morning in the briefing room before Scott McClellan starts his briefing, you know, people are sitting around and talking, and one of the topics, favorite topics over the past year has been what's going on in people's news organizations.
That's amazing.
And, you know, so a lot of them have cut out their White House correspondent.
Absolutely. And, you know, we just saw this week the much attended to sale of Knight Ridder newspapers, which was the second largest newspaper company in America, and the sale was forced by its largest shareholder, because it's a completely publicly traded company, and these shareholders could force this sale because they weren't satisfied with the returns.
And what was the return they wanted?
Well, they wanted it to increase, the profits to increase quarter by quarter. They wanted them to be as big as the Gannett Company's profits. And in many cases, the Philadelphia Inquirer, for example, was returning 8%, which brings down the overall Knight Ridder profits. I think last year they were returning, nonetheless, at least 20% net income before taxes. So we're talking about on every dollar, you know, they're getting 20 cents, which, I mean, grocers get 2 if they're lucky, right? So, and most retailers, I mean, that's easily twice what any retailer in this country would dream of getting. But, and it's not that anybody's a villain here, it's that we've gotten ourselves into a situation with Wall Street where there is an expectation of these profits. And therefore, media companies are judged as not being well run if they don't return them. And yet it's a cyclical business, and newsprint prices go up and down, and now advertisers are migrating to the web as eyeballs migrate to the web. And yet the amount of profit people are getting in the old media is way higher. Although the amount of profit they're getting online now, we're talking about a newspaper company, Knight Ridder, for example, got way more revenue from its old media products, but they're going like this, and on their new media products, it's going like this. And this line will cross, some people think, by 2010, and it could be before then. But are the companies investing into doing these sites the way that they ought to be doing it? No, because most newspaper companies are acting like cash cows. They're harvesting it. They don't really believe in the future. I mean, it's not that their CEOs don't, but this pressure from Wall Street requires them to behave like harvesters, and they don't invest in research and development or training. It's changing now, but it is a really worrisome situation, and the media aren't good at telling this story. Most publishers don't, want a whole lot about it in their business papers, for one thing.
That's true. How do you see the newspapers that that have blogs within them? How do you see them developing those? What are some ways that they could be very effective, that they could add to the newspaper? Because at the moment it seems like they're providing just news throughout the day.
Right,
You know,
and they're
some
just
more
kind of
stuff.
dumping their old media product on, or screen scraping,
Right.
you know, onto the new. Well, everybody knows that nowadays people, like the young people we're talking to, don't want the media to be a lecture. They want it to be a seminar. They want interactivity, and a newspaper is a lecture. Its website needs to be a seminar, so it needs to have all kinds of interactivity. It also needs to involve citizens as newsmakers, as news gatherers. Citizen journalism, this is called. It needs to have streaming video. It needs to have, you know, the ability to give you quick audio, and I mean all kinds of things that are coming to newspaper news sites. But the really inventive ones are figuring out how to give people very local information that they otherwise can't get. I mean, like, you know, Little League sports scores, you know, in Naples, Florida. There are wonderful experiments going on around the country. But a lot of what's happening now is kind of niche publications online. Like, there's some really cool sites like chicagocrime.org that was done by a couple of young people who are interested in journalism. One of them, Adrian Holovati, is now at WashingtonPost.com. He just wanted to do something in the public interest. It's very much what journalism in the public interest ought to be like. But he was living in Chicago. He looked at the Chicago Police Department site, and he saw that it had all this really important information that any citizen would want to use, but it was virtually impenetrable. It was unsearchable. I mean, you couldn't really use it. So he dumped it on his site and massaged it and manipulated it and made it into an eminently useful site. It's called chicagocrime.org, and it's just great. It's the kind of thing every newspaper ought to be doing in its local community.
One of the problems with blogs is, how do you know that what they have on them is correct?
You don't, and everybody ought to know that. I mean, if we think a blog is just as good as a local newspaper or any medium that is mediated and edited and attempts to live up to these commitments to comprehensive and fairness, it's not. That doesn't mean it's not good. It means it's a different beast. I mean, and of course, blogs are as varied as the number of blogs. There are people who are very dedicated to sourcing, you know, being sure when they cite things and letting their consumers know how to link to whatever information they're getting. And then there are just bloggers who are hot air artists, you know, windbagging their way across the web. I mean, there are some that are terrific and some, but none of them is a full media organization, and they don't attempt to be. I really welcome them, and I think they're great, but we need to recognize that most of them are not doing original reporting. They're doing a kind of an agglomeration. And what would they be if we didn't have the folks who are out there reporting, whom they're often beating up on, which is good because, in fact, it's making the old media more accountable. It's making them more transparent. And they sure needed that. They often behaved as if, you know, like doctors behind the screen. You can't understand this. You know, it's far too abstruse, my dear. Just trust me. Well, you know. We finally wised up and realized they're not trustworthy.
Yeah, one of the things that's happened as newspapers have come under pressure is that people want more transparency, and that's true, I guess, in other news organizations too. But newspapers seem to, in particular, have
and it's a good thing.
Have felt it.
It's a good thing, but it's tough to find your way. I mean, I think the New York Times has been a model for this. They've bared their chests, you know, when Jason Blair was this horrible. But in some ways, I think they overdid it. They had a double truck, you know, 2 full pages inside about this. I mean, we're finding our way. We'll figure it out. But people go, oh my God, you know, the horrible things that happened at the Times. Well, I mean, we don't see, you know, Enron doing this. I mean, we are holding ourselves accountable in the media, and it's a good thing, but we shouldn't. I think newspapers are doing or media are doing what they do. You know, now they're reporting on themselves, and we tend to go overboard. The way we went overboard, we go overboard about runaway brides or something. So we're not getting a balanced story. Nobody's refuting all the folks out there on the right, and now increasingly on the left. On the right, they're going liberal media, and on the left, they're going cowardly media, and nobody's refuting any of this. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not nearly enough people are saying, okay, look, it's problematic, it's flawed, it's a daily miracle in many ways, but what would we do without it? Let's all think about how to demand more from our local media. Let's believe in them. I mean, we got to believe in them. What kind of a democracy will we be if we succeed in beating them all to death and the commercial system we've got succeeds in, you know, exhausting them? I mean, the good news is there are a lot of new things happening, and we're really in a transformation.
Yeah.
And I'm an optimist, and good things will emerge, but it isn't clear yet exactly how. It's not clear how we're going to pay for journalism in the public interest, which is a very expensive thing.
Yeah.
I think we'll see more and more nonprofits playing a more and more important role. For
In
one
what
thing.
in what way?
Well, for example, the Center for Public Integrity, which is a foundation-supported organization right here in Washington, I'm on the board, I must admit that as a disclosure, is they've done most of the reporting on the lobbyist scandals these days, and they've been really important at it. They gather information painstakingly from the public records, and they report. And they're doing the kind of investigative reporting that fewer and fewer media are doing, and then they make it available to all the commercial media. National Public Radio is a nonprofit. It's got sponsors, but it's still more than 50% listener supported. That's one model. You know, subscribers pay about 10%, 20% at most of the freight at a newspaper, and that's one of the reasons they don't have as much say. If advertisers are not interested in you, if you live in some part of the state, you know, that is not part of my market as a newspaper, then the hell with you is what's happening, because advertisers speak. So a subscriber-supported model will let subscribers speak more loudly.
Yeah.
Different models like that, I think, may help.
You're talking about the media criticizing itself and not giving itself the kind of accolades it sometimes deserves. But one thing that hits me on that is the White House press corps. The White House press corps is continually damned as being lapdogs, and that's been true in any administration. They always seem to be regarded as lapdogs.
Right.
But it seems to me that reporters are judged by the answers they get rather than the questions they ask. And because they can't get information, because it hasn't come out in briefings or whatever, then people assume they never ask the questions.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know if you agree with this, because you see it so much more than I do. But it seems to me that White House reporters are damned if they do and damned if they don't. I mean, as you say, they are judged as cowardly or ineffectual if not much information comes out, which might just be skill on the part of the Bush administration at not letting information out.
Or just refusal.
Or exactly,
Right.
But I mean, really effective management. As Mike McHugh said at a meeting we were at last year, I mean, who knew you could get away with saying so little? You know, the Bush administration has really gotten away with saying less than any administration I've known. But that doesn't mean it's the press's fault. It means they're skilled at it. But the other way they can't win is if people do see press conferences and see them, or if they see David Gregory quoted, you know, as beating up on Mike McClellan, then people go, well, why are you so ill-mannered, you know, and these are our public servants you're up there tussling with, you know, so they're damned if they do and damned if they don't.
But you know, if an administration does not come out and explain itself of what it's doing and why it's doing it, how they got there, then it seems to me that they do suffer, because the public doesn't understand well enough just where they are. And I think this administration is suffering from that.
It took a long time. It's 5 years, 6 years. I mean, 5 years before they began to suffer.
Well,
is it mainly that they're suffering from, or is it the turn of events in the war and
well, I think the war, but and I think it's hard to bring them along. Well, 9/11 certainly did create another world, but I think that if you explain what you're doing and why,
I absolutely believe you.
as Clinton did, I mean, you look at the Lewinsky scandal and what his poll ratings were, and his poll ratings never suffered during Lewinsky, because he kept showing up for work, talking about what he was doing, and the public decided to focus on that.
I think the public isn't as concerned with personal behavior as public responsibility.
And in
I don't
huge
think he
issues.
explained himself very well. But I do agree with you fundamentally that, I mean, I hope you're right that there's a price overall. We certainly see a price. I mean, we saw it with the Cheney shooting incident. There was a real price, but, you know, people were mad at the press for keeping on harping at that. But the notion that he wasn't, you know, talking about it,
Right.
it didn't pay.
Yeah.
At Gridiron the other night, I mean, most of the jokes were about him and how, you know, the new policy. We have a whole new set of rules. Thanks to that, we're going to be sure we always release information within at least 24 hours, you know, and we'll be sure that it goes either to the New York Times or the Washington Post or some newspaper in Texas, you know, and it'll be released by Scott McClellan or some rancher. I mean, it was pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. But the briefings that took place in the White House after that, the following Monday, were tough briefings.
Brutal, it seemed like.
And
were you there?
Yes,
Yeah.
and both the morning one, which is not on camera, both Monday and Tuesday, the morning ones were tough, although I thought Tuesday afternoons was a little harder than the morning. But Monday afternoon were tough. And what reporters were doing is applying the pressure at the face of the White House, because the president wasn't speaking, nobody was speaking. So if the press secretary comes out and he is the only one representing the administration, then they're going to put all the pressure they have.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that the White House was unhappy with Cheney, too?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I do.
Sure, I mean,
oh, absolutely.
But
and, you know, it was an interesting case because it's one of those instances where you have a thread that you can pull, that you can see in some ways how things are working in the White House. I mean, you saw a difference in how the vice president's operation ran, and it was separated from the rest of the West Wing operation, whereas you would have thought that the two of them were very much a part of one another, but it looked otherwise. But all of the questions, and it's just no matter what McClellan talked about, how the American people are interested in other things. The reporters weren't, no matter who they were. What issues they normally were interested, they came back. And so the White House knew, because one of the things that the press corps is an indicator of the feelings outside.
Absolutely. There is
and
no
they know
question that the press is, I mean, people think, oh, well, the press is out there, you know, in the forefront. I mean, the press is very much a creature of a larger public. And when public opinion changes against a White House. I mean, it's a natural thing, you know, that the press is able to press further, but it also goes along with the rest of the political climate. The press is a creature of the larger universe in so many ways, and one of them is if they're, you know, right after 9/11, everybody said, well, the press wasn't questioning. Well, neither were the Democrats. I mean, an awful lot of what the press does is report on the political situation, and there wasn't anything to report on. I mean, that doesn't mean that the press shouldn't be pressing for answers, you know, as there was a clear build-up to war. But so should the Democrats have been. I mean, we had a completely, in my view, ineffectual, you know, loyal opposition. So I mean, you can only dig up so much if nobody in political power is you know,
coming up with the information. That it seems that often that happens, that the press is confused as its role is that as a critic of an administration. That's not its role. That's the role
to open the process to the public.
And it's the opposition party that's the critic.
The critic, exactly.
And so when the opposition party does not function effectively as a critic, then the news media gets more criticism because they are expected. You know, if nobody's doing if up on the hills doing the criticism, if they aren't effective, then the press should be, but that's not its role.
We also are really at an interesting juncture of this whole word objectivity. You know, I discovered when I was ombudsman at the Washington Post that objectivity is in significant part in the eye of the beholder. And too much of what happens now is that people beat up on the press if what they've written, they call it not objective if it doesn't agree with them. I mean, this happens on the left and it happens on the right. And that can't be the way to judge the press. But, I mean, I think our conversation here shows just how important it is that the public believe in its own right to have information, to be fully informed, that the public believe it's duty to be vigilant about the government, and that it sees the media as its tool, the process through which it can get the information, to be vigilant, because it can't, that no member of the public can be at all public meetings and, you know, overseeing the work of the businesses of our country. I mean, so, you know, we sort of, this is broken down in some ways. We've got lots of bomb throwers about everything, and we need to worry about this. And it's really the public in the end who's got to demand that the situation be fixed and that government be opened up, and that it be the exception that the procedures are secret and managed and all tidied up. And we can't solve our problems unless we know what they are.
One of the points you raised there is the responsibility of the public.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What is their responsibility?
Well, I really think it's to believe in their own need to be vigilant about what's going on in government.
And to what extent should they be responsible for searching for information? Like, people will say, well, I just don't know, that there's just no information out there. But there's a lot of information. I mean,
Absolutely.
you could,
More
you
than
know,
ever.
may not just be in Time and Newsweek, but it may be National Journal or Congressional Quarterly.
Absolutely. There's a ton of information. And there's a lot of good information online now from the government, for example, that we inadequately use. Not enough reporters even are doing the kind of computer-assisted reporting that would turn up the stories from the information that is made available. The citizen, the problem, of course, is that a lot of us let ourselves off the hook and say, oh, you know, it's a circular thing, don't you think? Because people say, I don't really believe the government is existing to serve my needs. I'm unhappy with the people in power, and so why should I read about what they're doing? They don't really care about me. And they also feel that way about the press, many of them, especially the press in Washington. Oh, those folks are just up there to see and be seen, and they choose stories based on winning Pulitzer Prizes or impressing their colleagues or getting fancied up in white tie to go hobnob with the president at the gridiron dinner or whatever. And there's some truth to all this. So it seems to me, fundamentally, we've still got a huge proportion of people who are very activist and engaged. We love to talk about the death of media, but on any given Super Bowl Sunday, way more people are reading their Sunday paper than are watching the football game, and nobody thinks football is dead. I mean, the majority of adults, even the famous, in their 40s, et cetera, read newspapers several times a week. So people do care about this, and what that means, I wish the public believed two things: that it really is up to them how the country is going to be governed, and two, that they have an ability to influence both the media and people in power. I mean, I've seen it. I had a fellowship in congressional offices, and I know it makes a difference when people call or email or write congressional offices. You know it makes a difference. And it makes a big difference when newspapers hear from you. Thoughtful demands for substantial information, not banging people over the head. I mean, criticism, yes, but not this, we approach people with such vitriol, and expletives and everything in the world. It just astonished me when I was ombudsman of the Post.
Yeah, can you tell us about your role? What you came in thinking that job was, and whether that was it? What you think the benefits of them are?
Ombudsmen, really are. There are only about 40 in this country out of 1,500 daily newspapers, so they're a pretty rare thing. Sometimes called ombudsman, reader's representative, public editor. They're fundamentally a way to hear the public, to be sure the public voice gets heard in the newsroom. And it varies from paper to paper. The Washington Post has a very strong ombudsman model, and it's been around 35 years. They hire someone of some standing in the journalism world, generally from outside the newspaper. You leave after usually 3 years. You're on a contract, independent. They don't edit your column in every Sunday paper, except for, everybody needs an editor, but not really for substance. And the goal is to listen to readers and also to bring your own independent judgment as a journalist to the newspaper. So, I heard all kinds of complaints, including every kind of complaint in the world about you're not fair to, you're not fair to blacks, you're not fair to Catholics, you're not fair to feminists, you're not fair to evangelicals. And frankly, any given story often gives people some pretty good fodder for that contention. So, you know, you do a lot of, well, you judge the paper over the course of time, and you do a lot of, but let me, you know, I'll pass it along. You also do a lot of, I had 2 hobby horses, really, and one, I think, did do some good, and one didn't. So one was on anonymous sources. I just feel so strongly that the Washington Post overuses anonymous sources. Again, I don't think we have the luxury of absolutism. You can't say never use an anonymous source. We've talked about stories here that emerged only because of anonymous sources, like the secret prisons. I absolutely believe in such stories. When someone would lose their job for talking about it, even have their lives endangered. But we use them way too often, you know, and that you rob the reader of an ability to judge the information because they don't know who said it or what the motivation was. And also, you really encourage people to speak with impunity. And if you're not going to be held accountable for what you say, you're loose-lipped and you'll call people names. It's not nearly as good a way to give people information, and yet it's, you know, lazy reporters do it all the time. So I harped and harped about this and had very little effect. I like to believe that I helped lay the groundwork for later effect. But the other one was that I talked a lot about the Post not being a very good local newspaper. You know, my daughter was in the public schools in Washington, D.C., and man, what you could learn about the public schools in D.C. from the Washington Post was, you know, local news for the Post is all this great, interesting international and national news. But this is a big city. It's got a lot going on, interesting stuff.
Don't you think it's improved?
Absolutely. That's the one I think I actually had some impact on those 3 years. They expanded. I mean, there were all sorts of conversations I ended up in, but I do immodestly believe that I helped in that regard. You know, it's a good thing to do, an ombudsman. Every paper ought to have one. I wish they did. I know why they don't. The editors always say, well, hell, if I had $70,000, I'd hire a couple of cops reporters. You know, they're under profit pressure. But and they also say, I'm the editor, the buck stops here, I'm the one who ought to hear this, you know. The editor doesn't have time, and also the editor listens differently, more defensively, whether you want to or not. Because you want to, you call me with a complaint, and I'm the editor. I want to help you understand why I made the decision I did. That feels like justification to you. You want to be heard. You don't want to have defensive justification. If I'm the ombudsman, you call me and I say, you know, you might be column fodder. It's my, you know, it's my job to listen. So the job differed in 2 ways. I actually enjoyed working with readers more than I expected. I thought, you know, everybody will call and kvetch and it'll be really kind of a painful thing. But the Washington Post readers are wonderful. And of course there were some jerks, but it's very interesting. I thought I would enjoy working within the newsroom. I found many in the newsroom to be overweeningly arrogant. I heard people say things like, do you realize you're talking to the Washington Post? And I'm going, oh my God, you know what? Usually they were the younger reporters, not the experienced veterans. But and I really was amazed at how many, you know, Edward R. Murrow said journalists don't have thin skins, they have no skins, and boy did a lot of them exist there at the Post. And a lot of people were very much loath to acknowledge that they needed to put a correction in the paper when I came to them with information. And readers would call me very often and with something that was wrong in the paper, I'd say, well, you should call the national desk first or whatever. And they say, oh, yes, I have, and listen to what they told me. Oh, I don't want to hear it. So I like which of these secrets are genuine secrets and which of them are secrets of convenience.
And, well, we can take we've had a lot of cases where news organizations and government have disagreed over what information should remain private. For example, the NSA eavesdropping story that the New York Times held for a year.
Yes.
That a lot of, when that came out, it made a great deal of difference to members of Congress.
Indeed, and there are people who feel that the great sin was the exposure of this information. There are others, of course, who feel that the great sin, to use a sort of a strange word, was the original wiretapping without warrants, according to the process laid out. Same with the secret prisons in European countries. Both of those stories, as you noted, the New York Times held the wiretapping one for a year. The Washington Post did not mention some of the European cities in which prisons were. Both of those show that even those eager media who are trying to get the word out are willing to weigh, I think sometimes too heavily, a government request to keep information private. You know, we often get the notion that somehow the press is just out there revealing willy-nilly and not thoughtfully weighing these decisions, and that is not my experience.
What did you think about the Times holding the story?
I'm a little troubled by it. I think there are valid reasons to hold the story. I didn't think their explanation of it was terribly...
Had a career in a lot of looking at journalism and the news business from a lot of different angles, because she was editor of the Des Moines Register. She is the ombudsperson at the Washington Post, and she's teaching in the journalism school at the University of Missouri. So you see it, and you are married to the bureau chief of McHugh, which is much in the news. So you see the business from a lot of different angles. What we're doing in the course is trying to get a sense of what do citizens need to know in a democracy, and what kind of information is government giving us. Are we getting the kinds of things that we should, and if we aren't, why aren't we? So it's general, but then we get down to some specifics as well.
Excellent. It's a great topic. I'm glad you're doing it.
Yeah, it is, and it's very much the topic. The book that they have to read is The Press.
Oh, that's great.
Edited
Marvelous.
by Geneva Overholser and Kathleen Jameson.
Yeah.
And it's a book that's worked very well.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, it's been very good.
Excellent. Hello, everyone.
Yeah. So what information do you think that the public needs in a representative government?
You know, I honestly believe, Martha, that they need everything they possibly can have. That doesn't mean that they can have everything. I mean, nobody can be a complete absolutist on this, because I think we all have to acknowledge that there are always going to be some kinds of information, genuine national security threats, troop movements. I mean, you know, we can begin to name several that I think almost anyone would agree we can't possibly put into all of our hands. But the fact is, we, in a very basic sense, need all the information we can get in order to govern ourselves. And if we're going to have a government by the people, for the people, of the people, then we've got to know what's going on. So I mentioned to you I was on this program recently with Tom Blanton, who's the head of the National Security Archive. I'm sure you know him. And he mentioned something that might be interesting to share with the students. He said only one time in the Constitution is secrecy mentioned. I'd never really thought about this. It's in Article 1, Section 5, and it says, each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings and from time to time publish the same, excepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. But it's the only mention of secrecy in the Constitution, and it's clearly the exception, not the rule. What worries me is that there are all kinds of reasons, beside the really valid ones, that those in power would prefer to keep information secret.
What are some of the reasons?
Mere convenience. I mean, it's awkward. You know, I think all of us who've ever run anything know that it's really pretty awkward to have to let all the information out. It's going to be much more complex to govern in some ways. Sometimes facts are embarrassing. That's a big one. If we make mistakes, you know, it's kind of human nature to keep them to ourselves. But how are we to know when information is kept from us satisfactory? Partly because their public editor, which is sort of the equivalent of the ombudsman, as you know, Byron Kalame, was not satisfied either. So he gave us reason to worry that maybe the Times didn't have all the best reasons. I'm sure a lot of them were about sourcing, and I respect the need to be very sure about your sources. I think it's commendable they did put the story out, and I would note that despite their having waited, they caught hell for putting it out, and now Bush is, you know, clamping down even more on leaks, and there are all kinds of legal threats about those who do leak, and even people who publish leaks.
Yeah. But we've been in Washington a long time,
Long
and we
time.
know that there's no stopping the leaking business.
No, of course, those very governments who say they want to stop the leaks also want to leak in their own, on their own
Right.
schedule and with their
Yeah.
own choice.
They just don't think of it as leaking.
Yeah, right.
They think of it as providing information at a time.
Slowly, telling the truth slowly.
That's right, a time and a method of their choosing.
Which, of course, those
Yeah.
leaks, too, are often useful, but it's a hypocritical stance to say they want to stop leaks.
Well, and then you can say in this administration, the White House has not had a lot of leaks, but the departments and agencies certainly have.
Well, it hasn't, this White House far better than I do, but of course we can consider it leaks. For example, all those conversations with Bob Woodward, in many ways, which end up in his book, are
Right.
leaks of a fashion.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
Well, what we do is about 45 minutes of, you and I talk, and then they come in.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
that's great.
So
I like to end
it'll
it
probably last 7:15, 7:30.
Perfect. Perfect. The McClatchy bigwigs are in town.
Oh, yeah, my
So
golly.
My husband's life has much changed.
Oh,
because
my
he'll
gosh,
become
because,
the Washington
yeah.
Bureau Chief for the whole shebang.
Yeah,
So
That's
we're
a lot of
dining with
papers.
some of them tonight.
Yeah.
The timing works fine. There's a lot of papers. Yeah.
oh, yeah. That's,
It's going to be 32
Yeah.
in all after they sell the ones they're going to sell.
yeah.
It's too bad they have to sell.
Oh, I know it. I just think, the Mercury, the
I know, and the
and the
Philadelphia Inquirer.
Inquirer. Yeah, that's really a
Sad
fantastic,
thing.
fantastic paper.
Antitrust?
Well,
Can
antitrust-
they sell it, or
Antitrust for the St. Paul Pioneer Press because McClatchy owns Minneapolis. The others are because McClatchy's business strategy is to buy newspapers in growth markets. And Philadelphia and Akron are not. And interestingly enough, San Jose, the fiscal situation is really pretty bad. So
Uh-huh.
that's the one that surprised me. Of course, after
Yeah.
the great boom, they grew, and now
Yeah.
it's a pretty.
Right.
They're really making very low profits. So.
yeah, and if you're in San Jose, well,
Michael, are we ready?
just don't.
All the sound and everything's all right?
Yeah.
Good evening. We have another good session for you this evening. Our guest is Geneva Overholser, who is